Hello and welcome to World History Encyclopedia. My name is Kelly and today I am joined by a special guest. I have Elodie Harper, the author of The Wolf Den. Thank you so much for joining me. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what the book is about?
Well, hi, it's so nice to be here with you. Thank you for having me on. So the book The Wolf Den is set in ancient Pompeii, and it's the story of the women who lived and worked in the Lupanar, which means wolf den and also means brothel. It's a building that still survives today. You can visit it. You know, the book's kind of based around that little neighborhood. And it follows the story of the five women who work there and the story of one woman in particular, Amara, and her, and basically she wants to get out of the brothel. So that's the story in a nutshell.
And it makes sense that she'd want to get out of the brothel.
She wants out, yeah.
So for people who haven't read the book yet and aren't aware, every chapter, at the beginning of every chapter, you've got a quote from either an ancient writer or from graffiti from Pompeii. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how that formed and also just how you incorporated it into the story and why graffiti?
So, as I know, Pompeii, and one of the most extraordinary things that survived from the town is when Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, it preserved a lot of the town at the same time as it destroyed it, so that when it's been excavated over the centuries, you know, so much of Roman life has been preserved there, evidence of how people lived, you know, whole houses have been preserved, streets, taverns, lots of things, and the brothel, obviously. But the graffiti, you know, which is in houses and on the streets, is like a unique look at the way people spoke. Ordinary people, you know, we have people talking in bars who are weavers, or, you know, not elite Roman speakers, which most of the texts obviously are by elite male writers. And the graffiti, so the first thing the graffiti does in Pompeii is give us voices of ordinary people. The second thing it does is a huge range of human emotions. So some of it is very obscene or very insulting, or, you know, just the kind of stuff that you'd get anywhere, with people sounding off. Some of it's very thoughtful and reflective. There's sort of genuinely touching love messages on there. There are people's anxieties, prayers to the gods, conversations between people, even, you know, some often quite jokey, a lot of sexual stuff as well. So you just get this extraordinarily vivid portrait of life in Pompeii. And I wanted to try and capture something of that voice, which in translation sounds incredibly modern and vibrant and humorous, and it's just incredibly vivid. So I wanted to incorporate it into the book. I didn't have a set method of doing that. So I had read the graffiti and knew parts of it that, you know, particular sections of graffiti that I was especially attached to, not all of which went into the book incidentally because they didn't fit, but then it is a trilogy, so there might still be room. But, you know, I looked at the graffiti first. I had an idea of what it said, and I knew basically where I wanted to go with my story. And it was a strange kind of almost organic process of fitting, have a kind of rigid thing of, right, now I'm writing a chapter and I'm going to, you know, pick the graffiti first, and then sometimes that would happen that the graffiti, I already knew what I wanted it to be at that point, and the chapter was around it. But oftentimes the two would kind of go together, and certainly with the texts, you know, I used a lot of Ovid's Art of Love, so I knew that text was going to be important in the book, in the chapter headings. But I didn't always choose exactly which point of those texts from the Art of Love in particular until afterwards. So, yeah.
Right. So you pretty much went both ways. Sometimes you already
Yeah.
knew the section and then you worked with them, then other times you knew what you wanted to write. And so you found a piece of graffiti or a piece of text that worked with that section.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I guess before I wrote, I had like a huge kind of compendium, both written down and in my head, of extracts that I wanted to use that I felt were meaningful for the characters in the story. And then, as the story progressed, I either at the time I was writing, and that was more often while I was writing, but occasionally shortly after writing, what went with what. And occasionally I did write at the end, change it, because I felt actually that doesn't fit. That wasn't the mood of that chapter. So
I definitely felt that the section, like each chapter, you could see the quote that you put at the start of the chapter. You could feel it permeate through the story in a way that felt really organic, but you can still pick out points from that quote that you've used in the chapter, which I think is awesome. There was one section where the graffiti is about a gladiator, and it's the gladiator's got a name, and then you've called the gladiator in your story the same name. And I feel like with the graffiti, it brings you a lot closer to the ancient world, because the graffiti that some of the ones that you've added, I mean, you'd probably seen modern versions of those kinds of quotes on walls in your daily life. So I think that, did you sort of feel closer to the ancient world as you were working on this story because of these
definitely quotes? And some people have said about the modern language in the book, but that was one of the joys of writing about the ancient world in particular, because it comes to us in translation, and so it is modern. In my view, if you read a decent translation of an ancient text, it's often translated into, highly colloquial contemporary language, because for the people at the time, that is what it would have sounded like. Whereas write about 16th century England, you can't do that, because we actually have the text in our own language of how they spoke. And that's, I think, I have such admiration for people who pull that feat off. I think it is just a challenge to do that, and it's much easier actually with the ancient world to do that, because these are people talking about their daily lives and concerns. It's impossible for that not to suck you in to a certain extent. Sometimes the stuff that people say also illustrates the strangeness and difference of life back then, or there are references to things that were obviously very common for them but aren't for us. So it's not always a way of making us feel, oh, this could have happened yesterday, but it definitely feels very immediate. But the whole of Pompeii is like that, really, as a site, because you can walk down the streets, and although they're semi-ruined, they would still recognizably be streets that people from 2,000 years ago would know. If they walked on them today, they would know where they were. If they walked into their house in the state it is in now, 2,000 years later, they would know that was their house. The paintings survive, the floors. It's the most extraordinary ancient site because of preservation, and the brothel in particular. I mean, it's been conserved especially well. They reconstructed the and so it feels very complete. The sort of lower level where you go in is, it's astoundingly well preserved, and it's extraordinarily like what it would have been for the women there 2,000 years ago. So yes, it's impossible not to feel quite a profound connection to the physical site.
I felt like when I was reading your book, like I was in Pompeii. I feel like you reconstructed it in a way that I could feel the heat, or I could feel how busy the streets were. Have you been to Pompeii? Did you walk the streets, and is that where this story began? Or did you already have that idea?
It didn't necessarily begin there so much, because I went there specially for a research trip. But yes, it's certainly, in terms of the actual writing of the book, I suppose you could say yes. It's yeah, walking into that brothel and just having the sense of it totally informed the way that I wrote the book, and kind of why I wanted to write it the way that I wrote it. And a number of days there, and being able to physically walk around the space, and both on a kind of more to pick up the atmosphere, but also just quite logistically, you know, working out what their immediate neighborhood was around the brothel. You know, there was the Elephant Inn directly opposite. There was this other tavern, which I, if it has a name, I wasn't able to find it, so I called it the Sparrow. And this little square that's there, and then, you know, where the water is. So when I described where they were walking, those were real streets I had actually walked.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's what I hoped to bring as well to the book. And then other times that wasn't the case. So it was in that very immediate neighborhood, but you know, not all of Pompeii has been excavated. And not all of it is in the same intense state of preservation as others. So, you know, parts of it are more ruinous than others. So even when I invented Pompeii, it was based on things that I remembered or things that I'd seen. So it was a kind of combination of that immediate environment of the brothel is extremely sort of based on the actual physical remains of the site, and then other stuff like, say, Zoilus's house or Cornelius's house. Those are imaginary places that are based on some of the grander houses that I visited.
That's awesome. It must have been so great to have physical, like things that you could see and walk down to inform the way you write.
Honestly, it
Was
was
it
amazing.
was it a helpful experience? Did you ever feel like, oh, I wish that there wasn't a building there, or did you ever have that as a hindrance?
No, because also, in all honesty, if ever the facts really got in the way of something I wanted to do, I did dispense with the facts. So, which sounds strange because I was so diligent about my research and it so permeates the book. And, you know, I tried 99% of the time to be absolutely accurate, but every now and then, you know, there comes a point where you are writing fiction and we just don't know how things would have been done, or they may have been done like a certain way, or it's maybe likely that they would have been done a certain way. But you can say to yourself, I think in justification, okay, but I'm going to choose to decide that X happens instead. So a couple of points where I did elaborate or change things slightly. You know, the harbour is based on a fresco of the harbour at Stabii, which is a nearby kind of resort further up the coast, an ancient resort, obviously. So there's a fresco in the museum at Naples that shows what an ancient harbour along that part of the coastline looked like. You know, it's only like a mile or so away from Pompeii, which at that point would have been a proper port, so much closer to the sea. So, you know, I tried to base it on that. It's quite an impressionistic sketch. But then I just thought, I want to put a giant column of Venus in the sea, you know,
Do it.
as the lead up. You know, we know there's the Colossus of Rhodes. Obviously, it wouldn't have been anything that spectacular, or we would have heard about it. But I thought, it's okay. I'm going to have a column of Venus to sort of underline to the modern reader, this is Venus's town, which it was. She was the patron deity of Pompeii. So that was, you know, I stuck it in there. We have no evidence such a thing existed. I just invented it. And in the necropolis, which I described later, you know, I deviated slightly at a certain point from what a necropolis would look like, but it was still had elements of what we know was there. So I only feel like I have to say that in case people read this book thinking absolutely everything is exactly as it was in the ancient world, and ultimately, you know, it's fiction. So,
I mean, yeah, fundamentally, the book is a story of fiction. I mean, you're allowed to have a creative license. And I mean, when I was reading it, I've obviously seen images of Pompeii. But for example, when you mentioned the Venus statue in the water, I just took it as, you know, that doesn't seem out of place. It's not like you've added things in that don't feel like they belong. But no, I thought that the Venus statue was such a good idea. And I didn't know that Venus was the patron deity of Pompeii. And I really enjoyed reading about the Vinalia. That was such a fascinating festival, and I was not aware of that.
the Vinalia, you know, the fact that Venus was the patron deity of Pompeii, she's also the patron of prostituted women or men, but you know, the patron deity of prostitutes. and of love and sex and, you know, all these things. And prostitutes were able to participate in certain public festivals in the ancient world. So although it was a very stigmatized way of life in some respects, you know, it was also accepted as part of life. So the fact that women could for a day, but there was the Venalia, there's also the Floralia, with two in particular ceremonies, one for Venus, one for Flora, that prostituted women could take part in. I wanted to reflect that in my book because I felt like for the women in my story, this would be really important. And I sort of built that. We've got Ovid wrote a whole book about how Roman festivals were celebrated, including the Venalia. So we have some evidence. I mean, it's quite fragmentary, hard to piece together. So I combined that with, there's a picture in a fresco in Pompeii of people carrying a god on a platform in some kind of religious festival. And I also thought about, you know, Catholic celebrations of the Virgin Mary that still take place in Southern Europe, and combined all of those things to create my own imaginary version of the Venalia of what it might have been like. So yeah, that was a really crucial scene in the book, both in terms of how I reimagined Pompeii, but also in trying to convey to people that yes, the women were prostituted and had incredibly hard, difficult, and stigmatized lives, but they were also part of their community in a very particular way, and in a way that is very unfamiliar to us. This idea that there would be a public kind of parade and celebration of prostitutes advertising themselves. And, you know, I could have gone into more sort of detail on the stuff, but I just wanted to give an impression of that.
You know, this whole book is sort of focuses on how these women don't own themselves, they don't own their body, they don't own anything, and yet they have this time where they can just be out in the open, walk with all these other women that are in exactly the same position that they are, and they know exactly how they feel. And I feel like you almost feel a tiny bit of hope for them as a little, I guess they're like a little family, aren't they? Your main 5 women. You sort of feel such a different, yeah, it's just a different feeling than the rest of the book. And I feel like the bond between the 5 women is such an important aspect of the book, and they're all so different. And so I wanted to ask a little bit about your 5 women. And so where did they come from? Are all of their names from graffiti?
So Cressa, Berenice, and Victoria are all real names from the brothel in Pompeii. So we have graffiti that they either wrote or was written about them. And Victoria in particular, she writes about herself in a very particular style. She calls herself Victoria the Conqueress, which if you read the book is exactly in keeping with her personality.
Definitely.
Amara and Dido, who are in many ways the sort of, Amara in particular, but also Dido, they're the major characters in the book. And I chose them names that I particularly wanted to fit with their characters. So Amara has a name that's given to her by Felix, which I'm not going to explain the meaning behind it, but she talks about that later. So it has a very particular meaning. And given the relationship between Amara and Felix, that he's the pimp, he's also the antagonist of the story, he's her nemesis. Their relationship is very important all the way through the trilogy. So I wanted, you know, and she's very much my own imaginary character. Well, they all are, obviously, you know nothing other than the names of Cressa and Berenice and very little else of Victoria. But, you know, that was what I wanted to do with her. And then Dido, because she's from Carthage and Felix named her as well, she's from a suburb of Carthage. I didn't include this in the book in the end because, you know, I cut it, but he calls her Dido because it's almost like a cruel joke calling her the name of a famous queen of Carthage, and now she's enslaved in a brothel. It's a reflection on his personality that she would have that name. So it's quite a long-winded thing about their names, but their personalities are hugely different. And the reason that I did that is because, you know, they would not have chosen to all be there together. They would have been very randomly thrown together, no particular connections to one another whatsoever. And they would likely have had very different outlooks, feelings, and beliefs about life. So, you know, Amara, I wanted to make her, in many senses, an outsider, both to the life in the brothel and to Pompeii, because we see the whole place through her eyes. And, you know, she started off, she was sold into slavery when her family became destitute. That was a totally sort of normal way for people to end up enslaved. But that's where she gets her real fire from, that she wants to get out, because she has known something else and she wants to get it back. Dido has a really, you know, tragic back history in that she was kidnapped. Again, completely regular that this happened to people. You know, she's from a little suburb outside Carthage, and people living in those sorts of places were quite vulnerable to pirates or bandits sort of just grabbing them and selling them off. So her experience of the brothel is more traumatic in many ways than any of the other characters, and she copes. Initially, at first, she obviously gains a lot of resilience as it goes on, but you know, they're all very protective of her. There's Victoria, Cressa, and Berenice. They were all born, but their roots in were all very, very different. So Berenice is from Egypt, you know, born into slavery, but she comes from a completely different part of the empire. Cressa is older. She has her own anxieties because of aging. You know, I saw her as about 10 years older than the other women. And Victoria is this incredibly strong, outspoken woman who, unlike the others who all pretty much hate what's happening, Victoria hates it, but she's also adapted by becoming incredibly good at her job, in inverted commas. So she's like incredibly popular with the customers. She's hugely successful. She makes a lot of money. The pimp really likes her because of the business that she brings in. He calls her his favorite whore. So her relationship reflects a different way that I think people adapted to being enslaved, which was just to go for it and embrace that role. But I didn't want to, you know, I didn't want to make too many of the women have Victoria's attitude, because I don't know that that's likely to have been the most common one, honestly, although it's very stereotyped in stories about prostitution, you know, the sort of, you know, that could become a stereotyped role, but I hope with Victoria that it very much isn't, because it's clear why she's behaving.
It doesn't feel like a stereotype role, and I think because you have the four other women that have different views of their life, but they're all different and they all stem from different reasons, I think that it just adds more dynamic to their little relationship and to the story in general. I think it makes it more believable, because to have all five of them all, I mean, obviously they all have tragic backstories, but to have one of them that is acting in such a different way, I think is really important. I thought that made it more believable. And I definitely feel like your book and these women have made it really clear to people that may just think that they've just always been prostitutes, that they don't have a good backstory, and that these women weren't necessarily always prostitutes. And I feel like it's really potentially will open people's eyes to the fact that these women they weren't always living this life, and they're not.
And also, one of the things that was really, really key for me writing the book was, we know it's set in a brothel. I mean, you know, the book, it's obvious. I had to dwell on the sex work. You know, I did not describe graphic scenes. You know, I didn't want that to be the focus of the story. We know that this is going on in their lives, that for some of them, you know, they've adapted and made the best of it. Others are profoundly traumatized by it. I didn't want to talk about that or write about it or dwell on it because we know this. You know, there are other ways of conveying that. What I wanted to talk about was all the other aspects of their lives. Exactly as you say, they were people, they had their own stories, their own families, you know, they grew up in different ways, their own expectations of life, their own hopes, their own relationships. You know, for them, life would not have been all about sex. They would have had their fun and enjoyment and hopes in other areas, you know, when they go out strolling around town together, you know, yeah, business, but also just to have a bit of a break when they go to the baths. And it's an all-female environment, and they can have a gossip and they can hang out and they go to the tavern, and you know, they're friendly with the innkeeper. Not every man in this story is awful, you know, the waiter is really lovely and he's in love with one of them. And you know, it's I didn't want it to be a kind of tale of sort of you know, this is just awful. And I also didn't want it to be a kind of, oh, look at all these giggling girls, you know, neither of those two things that are the kind of cliched tropes of talking about brothel life did I want to go down. So yeah.
Because I mean, in reality, it probably would have been a combination of both. They would have still lived their lives as best as they could while still having to do this job. And you're right, you didn't show any sort of explicit detail, but you knew exactly what the characters felt and how they reacted to their job without actually having to talk about it really at all, which I thought was really wonderful, because that could potentially be a very polarizing thing to put in a book. You know?
Yeah,
So
think that, you know, nobody should ever write like that. You know, somebody else might write it really well, so I wouldn't want to be judgy about it. But for me personally, I neither felt I wanted to write nor would want to read any very graphic descriptions of traumatic sexual activity. It just it's not for me. So that's not what I did.
and for your story, you didn't need it, I don't
No,
think, at all.
because yeah.
So we've talked about the women in the book. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the main male characters? So we've probably more Felix, Paris, maybe Rufus as well. Where did they come from and how did they develop?
So Felix and Paris are also names found in the brothel, and Paris in particular, who's referred to as beautiful Paris, was almost certainly, you know, working in the brothel. And although I started the novel sort of thinking of it, and it is very much from a female point of view, the thing that struck me both in the research and writing it was also how very little agency so many men also had. And Paris in particular, um, you know, he's not the most sympathetic character at all, but no, um, but he's also just incredibly, well, to me anyway, I found him very, very poignant because he's not got any of the camaraderie of the women, because both because he rejects them, but also because he just doesn't fit, because he's in such a stigmatized role as a man who has to perform sex for other men. And that surprised me too, in the sense that I had always, before sort of researching this, thought, oh, well, you know, the ancient Romans weren't homophobic. They sort of had these idealized gay relationships, but actually it's all about power dynamics in their view of sex and relationships. So the person who doesn't have power, which is automatically the woman in a male-female relationship, is always lesser. But when together outside this very kind of idealized stereotype of the kind of younger guy and the older man, the guy who has the least power is horribly kind of stigmatized. So Paris neither can have the friendship with the women and belong with them, nor can he have the respect of the other men who work in this kind of slightly gangster style brothel. So his loneliness, I felt, was quite key. And then Felix, who's the pimp, he starts off, you think he's just a monster, and he is pretty monstrous, but I really didn't want him to be that way. As the book goes on, we can see the similarities between Felix and Amara, the fact that there may actually have been some similarities in their background, which I won't spoil, but also that they're two people who have found themselves in sort of survive or die situations really. And in that case, you might have to make some pretty terrible choices and do some terrible things. And as Amara's capacity for doing things that are maybe not so nice as the book carries on, we understand that she is much, much more like Felix than perhaps either of them had grasped, and also that perhaps then that may or may not make Felix more like Amara, which makes him more sympathetic. In terms of, I would say, in terms of the relationship Amara later has with a wealthier patron who she sees as a way out, I wanted that storyline in some ways to be a kind of anti-Pretty Woman. So to interrogate whether it's ever possible, even when somebody's nice and kind of seems to be on a white horse and all the rest of it, is a relationship where one has all the power, quite literally in that case, in that he's free and she isn't, and he has the power to buy her. Is it possible for her to love him, or even know if she loves him, when what she needs from him is so huge, and what he can take from her is kind of nothing to him?
I definitely feel like as the book went on, especially Felix and Amara, both the way that both their relationship and the characters separate developed so much. And you do, because I mean, I feel like they make comparisons to each other throughout the story. But even without that, I think you'd notice. And at some points, you know, I was feeling bad for Felix, and I'm like, I don't want to feel bad for Felix, but I feel bad.
Oh, I'm glad you felt that. I wanted to mess with people's heads where Felix is concerned.
It was very conflicting, which was so fascinating. And I think that it definitely added an extra layer to the whole story, that none of these people necessarily had a choice, regardless of whether they have the power or not. You know, and no one is all good or all bad. I think that there was a lot of morally greyness about the characters and about just the whole story in general, which I thought was important, because just because they've been sold as prostitutes doesn't mean that they're necessarily 100% good people, versus, you know, the guy who does the pimping out.
Yes,
necessarily all bad.
Yeah.
My last question was if you can tell us anything about your other two books, since it is a trilogy. Now, obviously, if you can't, that's fine, but I thought that I'd ask.
Say very little because it will give too much of the plot away, but I can say that the Felix Amara dynamic runs through as a key driver, that Amara is, you know, Amara and all the characters will return, all those left standing, and it's Amara's story. And that, I guess that's about all I can say.
Thank you so much for joining me today and chatting to me about your book, The Wolf Den. Now, if you want to purchase the book, I will leave the links for it down below, as well as all of your social media links. So if anyone's interested in following Elodie on Twitter or Instagram, you'll be able to find all of that as well down there. And also a book review that I wrote on the book, you'll also be able to find down below. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
This video was brought to you by World History Encyclopedia. For more great articles and interactive content, head to our website via the link below. World History Encyclopedia is a non-profit organisation, so if you'd like to support our work, you can head to our Patreon via the pop-up in the top corner of the screen or via the link down below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you soon with another video.